In the Old West, the truth isn't always what it seems. Every story here is born of dust, loss, and revenge. And voices of the Old West. And this is another scar etched in the earth.
Before this story begins, understand this. Dustpine isn't just a forgotten dot on the map. It's where loyalty dies and the past never stays buried, where the silence is heavier than bullets and every smile carries a threat. In this place, justice is a matter of perspective and survival is its own kind of sin. Let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for the rest of this story. You won't want to miss what comes next. The morning pressed down over Dustpine like a hand trying to suffocate the land. Dry heat settled into the wood of the abandoned stables and soaked into the faded bones of the Voss family farm. Eleanor Voss stood near the fence line, her boots anchored in soil that had never forgiven the blood spilled there 5 years ago. Her eyes scanned the fields out of habit more than hope, until she noticed the shape collapsed near the brush. The boy looked more like a shadow than a person. His skin, stained with dust and old blood, seemed to merge with the ground. One arm clutched his ribs, the other was limp. Everything about him screamed flight, pain, and the kind of fear that came from being hunted. Eleanor approached, cautious but drawn by something she couldn't name. The boy flinched when she reached him, his body instinctively curling as if expecting a final blow. His presence was wrong. He didn't belong there, but neither did she anymore. That land had already taken everything from her. Her father's fall, her brother's death, the silence that came afterward. It had carved out pieces of her until only grit remained. And yet she lifted him, half dragging, half carrying the boy toward the barn. The old cellar beneath the hayloft hadn't seen use in years, but its darkness welcomed the broken without question. She laid him on the dirt floor, cleaned his wounds as best she could, and tried not to look at his face too long. He was young, too young to be wearing the weight of someone else's war. That was what it felt like, a borrowed war that he was trying to survive. When she removed the remnants of his shirt, the ink revealed itself, a black crescent, sharp and unforgiving, marked high on his chest. Eleanor froze, her stomach twisted. That same symbol had been etched into her nightmares since the night Rhett fell. It wasn't just a mark, it was a sentence, a brand that belonged to the gang that had taken everything. That night, the cellar felt colder than it should have. Eleanor sat by the trapdoor, staring into shadows that didn't move, wondering if she had just brought her brother's killer into her home. The boy moaned in his sleep, trapped in whatever memories haunted him, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that fate had delivered something to her doorstep, whether as punishment or justice she didn't know yet. And in that stillness, she realized the past wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. The sun climbed higher over Dustpine, but light did little to warm the air around the Voss farm. It remained heavy, still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Inside the house, Eleanor stood by the cracked kitchen window, watching a vulture circle lazily in the sky. Her coffee had gone cold in her hand, forgotten like so many things lately. Below her feet, beneath warped floorboards and a faded braided rug, the cellar hid more than a boy. It hid a question Eleanor hadn't stopped asking herself since the war ended. What if the wrong people had survived? Jesse hadn't stirred much during the night, though his fever had worsened. His breath came shallow and fast, limbs twitching in some silent terror only he could see. Eleanor had crept down once at dawn, laid a wet cloth on his brow, and tried not to let her eyes linger on the brand burned into his skin. She'd failed. The mark seemed darker in the low light, more permanent, more personal. It wasn't just that Jessie bore the symbol, it was the way it sat there, like a scar tied to her own. The same crescent Rhett had described once in hushed tones, weeks before his death, when he'd whispered about something he shouldn't have seen near the old rail track. The same crescent the sheriff had pretended not to recognize. Back then, no one had wanted to listen. They'd buried Rhett with his dignity stripped, and they'd buried the questions right along with him. The sound of hooves crunching gravel snapped Eleanor out of the spiral. Dust kicked up in the distance. A lone rider moved slow down the path leading to the porch. She knew that shape, broad shoulders, a coat too clean for a man who claimed to uphold the law in a dying town. Sheriff Harlan Briggs didn't need to knock. He just pushed open the gate and let the wood slam behind him. His eyes scanned the property with that slow, calculated calm that always made Eleanor feel like she was being measured for something she didn't want to wear. He hadn't come just to say good morning. Inside, she wiped her palms on her skirt and steadied her breath before stepping out. He met her with a nod that carried the weight of a favor not yet owed. The conversation was brief, but every word unsaid spoke louder than those that were. He asked if she'd seen anything unusual, anyone passing through, anyone hurt. She lied without blinking. The sheriff didn't press. He let the silence hang like a noose, then stepped closer, just enough for the air between them to tighten. There was history in that space. Her father's body had been found hanging from the rafters 3 months after accusing Briggs of protecting men he couldn't name. That truth had dried up fast, swallowed by the desert and the town's need to keep breathing. Before leaving, the sheriff let his gaze fall on the barn for a moment too long. Then he turned and rode off, dust curling behind him like a snake's tail. Eleanor waited until the sound of hooves disappeared before locking the door. The cellar called to her with a weight she couldn't ignore. Jesse was half awake when she lifted the trapdoor. His eyes fluttered open but didn't quite focus. He mumbled through cracked lips, caught in a memory. Words spilled out, fragments mostly, names she didn't recognize except one, Rhett. The sound of it in Jesse's mouth turned her stomach. She knelt beside him, unsure if he knew what he'd said or if it was just a ghost tugging at his subconscious. He didn't respond when she spoke his name. His breathing slowed, fever still burned under his skin. Back upstairs, Eleanor couldn't sit still. She moved through the house like a spirit unsettled, touching corners she hadn't touched in years. Her hands brushed over old photographs, dust-covered ledgers, and the gun Rhett had left behind, unloaded, unused, and hidden deep in a drawer she never opened. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the cellar door, listening to every sound. A cough, a murmur, a silence that stretched too long. Doubt gnawed at her, louder than the wind clawing at the window panes. Jesse had the mark. He knew her brother's name, and somewhere in that fevered boy's mind, buried under pain and dirt, and whatever life had done to him, lay a truth Eleanor wasn't ready for. But she would have to be, because Dustpine didn't offer second chances. It just waited for you to break. The morning broke without color, just gray light and wind that carried the scent of gun oil and dry grass. Eleanor stood on the back steps, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the barn like it might disappear if she blinked. Her body ached from tension, but her thoughts were sharper than ever. Dustpine had its own rhythm, an undercurrent that hummed beneath routine, and today that hum felt off, as if something was shifting just beyond the edge of what people admitted to seeing. She felt it, in the way the birds hadn't sung, in the way her neighbor's dog had barked at nothing until its voice gave out. Jesse had slept in short bursts, but the fever was finally breaking. He didn't say anything more in his sleep. No names, no places, just quiet, labored breathing. Eleanor had changed his bandages, brought down water, and avoided looking at that mark again, but it hovered in her mind like smoke. The wind picked up just before noon. It kicked dust against the windows and turned the sky a pale, sour yellow. Then came the sound. Boots on wood, not hers, not Jesse's. Someone was on the porch. The knock was slow, deliberate. Eleanor opened the door with caution, carved into every line of her face. Sheriff Harlan Briggs stood with one hand resting casually on the grip of his revolver, the other brushing invisible dust from his coat. His badge, dull and scratched, caught the sun for a moment before he stepped inside uninvited. He walked through the house like he'd done it before, not searching, not asking, just looking. Every glance a quiet challenge. He asked about strays, travelers, injured boys. Nothing direct, but enough to make the air between them thick. Eleanor said nothing more than necessary. Her voice stayed even, her face unreadable, but inside her nerves clawed at her ribs. She could almost feel the trapdoor beneath her boots, the outline of Jesse's still body beneath her floorboards. The sheriff paused at the table, tracing a fingertip along a groove in the wood. Then he looked at her, not like a man studying a woman, but like a dog watching a rattlesnake, unsure who would strike first. When he left, he didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. He was watching, waiting, and he didn't believe a word she'd said. Eleanor didn't move until long after the sound of hooves had faded. Her breath stayed shallow. She looked around the room, tracing every weak point, every secret. Her house had become a battlefield, and the enemy had already walked through it. She went to the barn next, checked the cellar. Jesse was awake, barely, and his eyes met hers without fear this time, just exhaustion, resignation. He knew what was happening. He didn't ask for help and she didn't offer it, but something passed between them in that moment, an understanding. Neither of them was safe anymore. Later, she sat alone on the porch, rifle across her lap, eyes on the path leading back to town. Her thoughts spiraled, back to her father, back to the day he died with a rope around his neck and questions no one would answer. He'd said things, dangerous things, about the sheriff, about hidden deals, smuggled goods, quiet payoffs. And now Jesse was here, marked, silent, hunted. Eleanor felt it rising in her, the same helpless fury she'd buried years ago. This wasn't about mercy. It was about unfinished business, and Dustpine had a long memory. The storm rolled in without warning, carried by winds that twisted across the plains like they meant to tear the land open. The sky darkened too fast, and the clouds didn't rumble, they growled. Eleanor paced the kitchen with tight shoulders, listening to the first spits of rain drum against the windows, knowing something was coming that had nothing to do with weather. Below her, the house groaned like it remembered pain. She felt it in the floorboards, in the old beams that had survived fire, drought, and betrayal. The past pressed in from every side. In the cellar, Jesse's fever had broken, but rest didn't come with it. His body had cooled, but his mind hadn't. He drifted between sleep and waking like someone whose soul hadn't made up its mind. Eleanor had stopped checking on him every hour, not out of apathy, but because she couldn't look at him without seeing that mark, glowing in her memory like fresh branding iron. The storm deepened. Thunder cracked across the sky like a warning shot. That night, she didn't sleep. Somewhere near midnight, something, instinct or fear, pulled her from her chair. The wind howled through the walls. The oil lamp flickered. Her steps creaked across the floor as she moved to the rug, knelt, and pulled it back. The trapdoor felt colder than before, as if the storm had seeped into the ground. She opened it slowly. The cellar was still. Jessie lay motionless, barely more than a shadow in the half-light. She stepped down the wooden steps, her breath shallow, her mind louder than her footsteps. She crouched beside him, unsure if she expected him to wake or die. Then he stirred, a twitch in his fingers, a shudder through his shoulders. His face turned toward her, not fully, just enough. Then his eyes opened, and in them, she saw it. Not recognition, not clarity, but something darker. His gaze didn't look at her. It looked through her. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and loud where men bled and screamed. His mouth moved. Words came out in broken fragments. Eleanor leaned closer, unsure if she wanted to hear them or stop them. Then came the shift. His body tensed, his breath caught, his eyes narrowed, and just for a heartbeat, his expression changed. She saw it, that same look she had never forgotten, the one seared into her memory the night her brother died. A split-second flash of certainty, the look of the man who pulled the trigger. It wasn't Jessie's face that made her recoil. It was the echo of that look, that rage, that certainty. She stumbled back, heart pounding, her legs unsteady. Jessie's eyes fluttered shut again, lost to the storm inside his own head. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Eleanor sat on the cellar steps, shaking. Her mind screamed for logic, for explanations. Jessie was young, broken, branded. But could he have been there? Could he have done it? Or worse, could he have watched? The storm raged above them, shaking the shutters and rattling the window panes. But inside, the silence was heavier. Eleanor closed the trapdoor without a sound, but she didn't leave the room. She stayed there, sitting alone in the dark, staring at the floor like it might offer answers. Her fingers gripped the wooden frame so tight her knuckles ached. Something inside her cracked that night. Not trust, not yet, but the thin, frayed thread of hope, the one that said maybe she was wrong, was unraveling fast. And she didn't know which truth would be worse, that Jessie was innocent or that he wasn't. The storm left Dustpine hollow. Puddles turned to mud, but the ground hardened fast beneath the rising sun, as if refusing to show signs of weakness. Eleanor moved through her morning with movements stripped of grace, mechanical, distant. Her hands poured coffee, her eyes watched the horizon, but her mind remained locked in the cellar, replaying what she had seen in the boy's face. She needed answers, not from Jessie, not yet. She didn't trust what fever and fear might do to memory, but there was one person who might still know how to read the veins beneath this town's skin. The saloon didn't open until noon, but Maggie always arrived early. Not to drink, not anymore, but to be present, to keep her seat in a place where presence still meant something. Eleanor found her leaning against the bar, sleeves rolled up, polishing glasses that hadn't seen use since the last cattle drive. Her hands moved with habit. Her face, however, wore nothing but exhaustion. Maggie had been the daughter of a blacksmith once, proud, loud, and unafraid. Life in Dustpine had ground those edges down into something quieter, harder. Eleanor hadn't seen her in weeks, maybe more, but Maggie didn't ask questions when she appeared. That was the nature of their friendship. Words had weight and silence had currency. They talked like people who knew how to speak without saying everything. Eleanor asked about movement, strangers in town, whispers of old names resurfacing. Maggie answered with care, eyes flicking toward corners as if the walls could hear. There had been talk, not loud but persistent. A name here, a sighting there, stories about a network running through ranches south of town, moving weapons like cattle, guarded not by drifters, but by men with loyalty bought in blood. And at the center of it, or near enough, the same mark Eleanor had seen on Jessie's chest, the crescent, Some said it belonged to a dying gang. Others claimed it had become a brand of inheritance, passed down from father to son, master to recruit. No one said the name aloud anymore, not after what happened outside the grain mill 5 years ago. Maggie's tone shifted when Eleanor mentioned that night, the one that took Rhett. She hesitated, glanced toward the swinging doors, then leaned closer. There had been someone watching from the alley that night. Not a gunman, not a fighter, a boy, barely standing, eyes wide with something beyond fear, and someone in uniform had pulled him away before the crowd gathered. Not a deputy, not a soldier, someone with authority. Eleanor felt the edges of her world shift. The frame around her memories began to crack. She remembered the sheriff's arrival that night, how quick he'd been to close the scene, to push people back, to say Rhett's death had been a result of his own dealings. But what if it hadn't? What if the only truth told that night had come from a pair of eyes in the shadows? Jesse might have been that boy, or someone like him. Eleanor left the saloon without finishing her coffee. Dust clung to her boots. The streets felt quieter than they had before, the kind of quiet that meant someone was listening. Back at the farm, the house felt colder. Jesse was awake when she returned, sitting up in the cellar's low light. His body looked smaller than before, shrunken from pain and silence. His gaze followed her as she stepped down into the dirt, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. Something in his posture had changed. No longer just the hunted, but someone who knew his time in hiding was running short. Eleanor didn't ask why he hadn't run when he could have. She didn't offer comfort. There were no more illusions between them, only questions hanging like fog. And now, the answer was beginning to form. Not in words, but in the way Jesse refused to meet her eyes. In the way Maggie's voice had faltered, and in the way Eleanor's heart had begun to stitch truth from a dozen broken pieces. Rhett hadn't died by chance. He had been silenced. And Jesse might be the last living witness to that crime. The trapdoor closed behind her with a dull final sound. And above them, the wind began to shift again. The land outside Dustpine stretched out in brittle silence, its stillness broken only by the low rustle of dry grass and the groan of wooden fences left to rot. Eleanor moved through it, like someone walking a tightrope, measured, inward, suspended between fury and restraint. Back inside the barn, the air in the cellar clung thick with dust and unspoken truths. Jesse sat propped against the wall, paler than before, his limbs thinner beneath the dirty shirt she'd given him. His fever had lifted, but something heavier weighed on him now. It lived in his shoulders, in the way his hands fidgeted when she entered, in the way his eyes didn't follow her as they had before. Eleanor didn't waste time. She needed the truth. Not hints, not guilt, not half-formed regrets that spilled in sleep. The name Rhett had already escaped Jesse's lips once. That alone had sealed his place in her life, whether he knew it or not. There was no softness in her questions, only necessity. Every word spoken in that dim space echoed like judgment. Jesse didn't interrupt. He barely moved. But slowly, under the weight of her certainty, he began to unravel. He admitted what she already knew, that he had been near the grain mill the night Rhett died. Not as a gunman, not as a part of the circle that raised weapons in the dark. He had been there to watch, to listen, to obey. His father had brought him. A man bound to the same group Eleanor had feared all her life. The men with crescent brands and hollow honor. Jesse had stood near the edge of that firelit clearing, still small enough to be ignored, still young enough to believe his silence meant survival. But survival had cost him more than truth. He described the scene like a prisoner reliving the first wound. Rhett had been surrounded, not by outlaws, but by men in clean coats, faces known in Dustpine, faces that smiled in church pews and handed out supplies at the rail station. And one among them had worn a badge. Not just a badge, the badge. Eleanor's breath caught before she could stop it. Jesse hadn't seen the shot fired, only heard it, sharp and sudden. But he had seen what came after. The silence, the retreat, the way the sheriff had arrived too quickly, already knowing who to silence and who to call a thief. Jesse had wanted to run, but his father's hand had been iron on his arm. Now, years later, the hand was gone, and Jesse was still running. He didn't cry when he finished, neither did she. But the silence that followed was deeper than grief. It was confirmation. Everything Eleanor had suspected about that night had been true. Rhett hadn't stumbled into danger. He had been silenced, buried beneath a lie written by the very man who still enforced law in Dustpine. She stood slowly, her spine straightening beneath the weight of clarity. She looked at Jesse one last time, now no longer a stranger but a witness carrying the same scars carved into her own past. Above them, the wind scratched against the walls like fingernails. There would be no turning back now. Dustpine had hidden its rot for too long, and Eleanor wasn't interested in burying any more truth. By morning, Dustpine wore its usual mask, sun-bleached calm and slow-moving shadows, but Eleanor felt the change humming beneath it, a warning curled deep in her gut. The town had begun to stir in ways that only fear could provoke. Something unseen had shifted, and it was moving faster than truth could catch. The first sign came nailed to the post outside the general store, a paper wrinkled by wind, flapped against sun-worn wood. Jessie's face, sketched in charcoal lines too harsh for someone so young, stared back at her from beneath the word "wanted." The price beneath his name was enough to wake the greedy and the desperate. Not for robbery, not for assault, but for murder and theft from the town's grain reserve, a charge that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. It was a lie, and a loud one. The kind of lie built not to hunt, but to silence. By the time she returned home, the dust on the road was already thick with fresh tracks. Too many for a town this small. Strangers were coming, drawn by blood money, stories of outlawed boys, and whispers planted like weeds by men in high chairs. Eleanor didn't ask how the bounty had spread so quickly. She already knew. Harlan Briggs had written it. Kane Leary arrived by dusk. His name hadn't been said in Dustpine in over a decade, but his reputation still walked ahead of him like a second shadow. Lean, sun-worn, and dead behind the eyes, Kane wasn't just a hunter. He was a collector of secrets, of sins, of things people left buried. And once his boots hit the ground, the town shrank back without needing a reason. He didn't knock when he reached the Voss farm, just stood in the dirt and looked at the house like it was already caving in. Eleanor watched him from the window, motionless. He didn't move either. He didn't have to. This was how men like Kane did their work. Slow, steady, inevitable. Back in the cellar, Jessie had gone quiet again. Not from fever, but from something colder. He had heard the bounty price, he had seen the poster, and now he waited for the knife that always came with it. There was no panic in his eyes anymore, just the dull weight of knowing he had become a number, a reward for men with empty wallets and empty souls. Eleanor sat beside him in the dark, both of them breathing slow. The betrayal was loud without being spoken. Harlan hadn't just marked Jessie, he had ensured that every lowlife from here to the next state would come sniffing for blood. This wasn't justice. It was strategy, and worse, it was personal. Kane wasn't just any bounty hunter. He was tied to Harlan in ways Dustpine didn't like to speak about. Old jobs, old debts, rumors about ranch fires, missing riders, and weapons lost in accidents. Men like Kane didn't work for gold, they worked for silence. Eleanor knew now what had to happen. They couldn't wait for proof, they couldn't trust the law. They couldn't lean on the town's memory. The only thing that could speak louder than lies was evidence, and there was only one place left to look, the old mine, where Jessie had once followed his father on quiet errands, where guns had changed hands, where men with brands had gathered beneath torchlight. That's where the answers were buried, not just about Rhett, but about everything. The cellar door closed gently behind her. Outside, the air had thickened, not with rain, but with tension. Kane Leary was watching, and Dustpine had begun to count the hours until someone pulled a trigger. They left before dawn, beneath a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to brighten or bleed. Eleanor packed light, a satchel of supplies, 2 canteens, a revolver, and a folded piece of paper she couldn't bring herself to read. Jessie moved with hesitation, his leg stiff but usable. The pain etched into his jaw never left, but he didn't complain. Neither did she. The journey to the old mine wound through dead valleys and broken hills, terrain shaped by fire and drought. Few remembered it now. Even fewer dared speak of it. Jessie had only vague memories of being dragged there as a boy, of whispered exchanges between men with weapons slung across their backs, of crates sealed in wax and silence. His father's voice had been clipped, careful. Instructions had been given, never explained. But the direction remained clear in his mind, mapped in trauma. The mine sat like a scar at the edge of the desert, half swallowed by rock and dust. No signs marked it, just an old rope nailed into a splintered post, limp in the wind. Inside, the darkness felt alive, stale air pressing in from all sides, thick with decay and memory. They moved slowly, lantern in hand, footsteps echoing off walls, etched with soot. Signs of life long gone lingered, rusted shovels, half-smashed crates. The outline of old footprints hardened into the ground. Jessie led them deeper, until they reached a pocket chamber carved into the stone. That was where the truth waited. The first thing they found was a pile of ash, disturbed recently. Beneath it, scraps of burned paper, not enough to read, but enough to suggest haste. Someone had tried to destroy records, names, orders, routes, not long ago, days, maybe hours. Then came the cross. Buried in the corner of the room beneath a loose board, it was no more than 2 sticks tied with twine. Eleanor froze when she saw it. Her breath caught in her chest as she knelt, reaching for it with hands she barely trusted. One word had been carved crudely into the wood with a knife: Rhett. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't a grave, it was a marker, a reminder, or maybe an apology. Beside it, half hidden beneath a slab of rock, lay a revolver, worn but intact. Its metal was scratched, dulled by time, but near the trigger guard, just above the grip, were 3 engraved letters that stopped Eleanor cold: HB. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. There was no longer room for doubt. The weapon belonged to Harlan Briggs, the same man who declared the case closed, the same man who called her brother a liar, the same man who still wore the badge in Dustpine, giving orders and rewriting history. He had been there, not just overseeing, not just covering. He had stood in that mine with a loaded gun and the weight of a secret that could ruin him. And when Rhett got too close to it, too curious, too loud, he had pulled the trigger. Jessie said nothing as Eleanor stared at the revolver. The only sound was their breath and the steady drip of water somewhere deeper in the mine. All the anger Eleanor had buried for years rose like floodwater, not just because of Rhett, but because of the silence that followed, the cowardice, the cover-up, the town that turned its eyes away, the friendships that withered under suspicion, the justice that never came. Jessie stepped back, giving her space. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Grief had long ago hardened into something else. When they left the mine, the sky had begun to darken again, not with storm, but with ash and wind. They didn't speak on the way home, they didn't need to. Eleanor now held more than a memory. She held proof, and Dustpine was going to feel it. The air back in Dustpine felt thicker than when they had left. It clung to the skin like guilt, dragging each breath lower into the lungs. Eleanor moved through it as if the mine still weighed on her shoulders. The revolver wrapped in cloth never left her grip, and the word carved into that wooden cross, Rhett, still pulsed behind her eyes like a fresh wound. Jessie stayed close, but silent. His leg had worsened. The terrain hadn't helped, nor had the cold nights. But he said nothing of the pain. There was a shift in him now, as if carrying the weight of truth had also planted something else inside him, something quiet and burning. The farm had changed in their absence. No signs of break-in, no disturbance, but the stillness was unnatural, as if the walls were listening, watching, waiting for them to fall asleep. Eleanor didn't rest. She kept the revolver close, tucked beneath the floorboards, and listened through the night for sounds that didn't belong. Jessie slept in short spells. When he did, he muttered in fragments again, but they were different now. Not cries of fear, but names, places, half-formed regrets. It wasn't until the third morning that something between them cracked. Jessie had managed to limp out onto the porch alone. He sat in the brittle morning light, with his head bowed, fingers gripping his knees. Eleanor watched from the doorway before joining him. Each step measured. The silence between them had grown long, but it wasn't empty. It was a silence thick with shared burdens. Jessie began to speak, not because she asked, but because silence had stopped being enough. He spoke of his mother, of how she had tried to leave Dustpine years before, had packed a single bag and pulled Jessie from the gang's orbit. But she hadn't gotten far. Her body was found near the tracks outside town. No one was charged, no one even investigated. Harlan had called it an accident, a fall, but Jessie remembered the bruises, the silence that followed, the look in his father's eyes that said, without speaking, she chose the wrong side. After that, Jessie stopped asking questions, stopped resisting. He became what they wanted him to be, silent, obedient, forgettable, until Rhett, until the night in the mine, when Jessie watched something honest get erased in front of him, something he couldn't forget no matter how hard they told him to. Eleanor listened without moving. The words hurt in places she thought had already scarred over. She hadn't expected Jessie's past to look so much like hers. Different names, same betrayal, same rot at the center. By the time he finished, the sun had risen fully, but the warmth didn't reach either of them. Jessie didn't look at her when he stood and limped back inside. Eleanor remained on the porch. What bound them now wasn't trust. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was recognition of wounds that didn't heal, of lives shaped by silence and violence disguised as order. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something had begun to grow. Not love, not yet, but something real. The kind of fragile thread that could hold two broken souls above the flood for just long enough to breathe. Inside, the revolver waited, and outside, Dustpine watched. Soon the line between memory and justice would snap, and Eleanor would be ready. Dustpine didn't wake gently that morning. It stirred like a cornered animal, eyes wide, movements stiff, waiting for something to strike. Word had already crept through the streets like oil. Eleanor Voss was back in town, and she wasn't walking like someone lost anymore. She was walking like someone who knew something. The revolver was wrapped tight in canvas, hidden beneath her coat. Its weight was no longer foreign. It felt necessary. Her boots moved with intent across the dirt, past the staring eyes of townsfolk who remembered her name only when it made them uncomfortable. Her destination was fixed. The saloon. Maggie was already behind the bar when Eleanor arrived. Her posture stiffened the moment their eyes met. There had been no contact since Eleanor's last visit, no letters, no messages. And yet, the silence between them now felt louder than any conversation they had ever shared. Maggie greeted her with a glance that tried to feign calm, but the twitch in her jaw betrayed the truth. Fear had taken root somewhere deep, and Eleanor recognized its shape. The two women didn't speak in public, not with others around. Instead, Eleanor waited until the room thinned, just long enough for whispers to lose their meaning. Then she leaned in, placed the revolver down between them with care, and watched Maggie's breath catch. There was no need to explain. The initials on the metal grip did all the talking. Maggie didn't argue. She didn't even ask how Eleanor had found it. She only asked one question, and the answer she received made her go pale. That was when everything began to unravel. By noon, the trap was already in motion. Eleanor returned home briefly, only long enough to hide the revolver again, safer now, closer to her if things turned violent. But she wasn't the only one preparing. By sundown, Harlan Briggs had her in cuffs. The sheriff came with 3 men, all armed, all wearing expressions carved from stone. They searched the house under orders no one questioned. They didn't find Jesse. He had hidden far from the house as they'd planned, but they found other things, just enough to fabricate. Old ammunition, a copy of the wanted poster with notes scribbled in Eleanor's handwriting. A torn shirt stained with blood, Jesse's from days ago. It was all staged. She could see it in their eyes, but they didn't care. She was arrested for conspiracy to harbor a known criminal. Treason, they whispered. Assisting in murder. The charges mounted like storm clouds. The town didn't cheer, but they didn't stop it either. Eleanor was paraded through the streets, her wrists bound, her head held high. Every step felt like a sentence, not just for her, but for the silence that had buried her brother and fed the roots of men like Harlan for years. They locked her in the holding cell behind the sheriff's office, iron bars and cracked stone. Maggie didn't visit. No one did. But she wasn't alone. That night, Jesse returned. He didn't sneak in. He walked straight through the saloon doors like he wasn't marked, like his face wasn't plastered across the town in charcoal and blood. His presence lit the place like lightning. Patrons froze. Conversations died. And then came the voice. Kane Leary, seated in the corner, stood slowly. The bounty hunter's face didn't register surprise, just opportunity. But Jesse didn't flinch. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply waited. It was no longer about escape, it was about confrontation. And in the charged silence of that saloon, beneath the glass, the whiskey and the rusting chandelier, the final reckoning began to breathe. The truth was coming, and Dustpine would not be able to bury it this time. The saloon had never held that kind of silence, not even in its worst winters, not even after its bloodiest nights. Now every breath felt counted, every eye locked on the boy who shouldn't have had the courage to return. Jesse stood at the threshold of that broken place, not as a fugitive, but as a reckoning. Kane Leary rose first, slow and calculated, the way predators always do when they see the kill coming too easy. His hand hovered near the revolver at his side. The room watched, breathless, waiting for the flash of steel. But Jesse never reached for his own. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to end it. Harlan Briggs arrived minutes later, summoned by panic or pride. No one could tell which. He walked in flanked by 2 of his deputies, eyes cold and unreadable, coat unbuttoned as if expecting blood. The town had never truly seen him like this, not at the center of things, always on the edges, always cleaning up after the fact. Never under fire, but now he was. Jesse spoke plainly, no theatrics, just facts. His voice cut through the room like a scalpel, naming dates. Names and the place where he had stood as a child while Rhett Voss was surrounded and silenced. He spoke of the cross in the mine, the documents half-burned, the revolver with the sheriff's initials etched into the grip. He didn't accuse, he simply remembered. And then he opened his bag and pulled out the proof. The revolver, wrapped in the same cloth Eleanor had used, was placed carefully on the table nearest the center of the room. The initials glinted in the low light. No one needed to inspect them. Everyone recognized the style, the make, the truth behind it. Harlan didn't speak, not right away, but his stillness said everything. He didn't move for his weapon. He didn't deny. He just stood there, a man slowly swallowed by his own silence. Kane looked from the revolver to the sheriff. Something cold shifted behind his eyes. The bounty hunter didn't pull his gun. He just turned and walked out, quietly. No coin was worth what was now unraveling. The deputies hesitated. One stepped back. The other removed his badge and set it on the floor. Harlan remained where he stood. No shots were fired. No fight broke out. The violence was in the realization. Everyone had known, or suspected, but no one had spoken. Eleanor was released that same hour. No cheers, no apologies, just a key and a lock and a door swinging open into the night air. Maggie waited outside the cell, her face pale but steady, her eyes low with shame. There were no words between them. None were needed. What had been broken wouldn't be mended with apologies, only with time. Jesse met Eleanor by the steps. They didn't hug, they didn't speak, but something passed between them, not forgiveness, but freedom, and that was enough. By morning, Kane was gone. So was Harlan. No one saw them leave, but their absence screamed louder than their presence ever had. Dustpine didn't clap. It didn't celebrate. It just breathed. For the first time in years, it breathed. The fear was gone. Not replaced with hope, not yet. But the silence had been broken. And in places like Dustpine, that was the first step to healing. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the town itself was unsure how to function without a lie propping it up. Dustpine didn't change overnight. The dust still clung to every surface, and the same rusted signs still hung crooked over empty stores. But something in the air had shifted. No one said it aloud, but it lived in the way people looked at each other, like they were seeing through the fog for the first time in years. Eleanor packed with quiet hands. The Voss homestead had become a place of too many echoes, too many ghosts layered beneath the floorboards and walls. Her father's chair remained by the fireplace, untouched since the day he died. Rhett's boots, still tucked under the edge of the bed, had gone stiff with time. She left both where they were. Some things didn't need to follow her. Jesse worked beside her in silence. The limp in his step had become part of his movement, not weakness, but memory. He didn't ask where they were going. He only asked what they would leave behind. She didn't answer. He already knew. Before they left town, Eleanor stopped once more by the hillside where Rhett was buried. The grave was marked with a cross made by her own hands. Nothing ornate, nothing scripted, just wood and soil and the truth of what had been taken. She knelt beside it, her breath steady, and unfolded the letter she had carried with her for years. Rhett's last words. She had never read them, not fully. Grief had always made it feel too final, but now her hands didn't shake. The ink had faded in places, but the message was clear. He had written about the weight of watching something wrong happen and knowing no one would believe him. He had written about Harlan, about a shipment he'd seen in the night, about how something inside him refused to stay quiet, even if it meant danger, even if it meant death. But more than anything, he had written about Eleanor. He'd told her not to let Dustpine change her. He'd told her not to carry his silence as her own. The wind moved through the grass as she read, as if the land was listening. Jesse stood behind her, giving space, understanding that this wasn't a moment for two, but one. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it beneath the stone at the foot of the cross. Not buried, just anchored. They left at sunrise. No one stopped them. No one tried. They didn't ride off like heroes. There was no glory in what had happened, no vindication, only survival, only the quiet strength of people who had chosen to live after everything had been taken from them. As they crossed the edge of town, Eleanor didn't look back. Neither did Jesse. Ahead of them stretched another state, another chance. The road would not be easy. Nothing ever had been. But this time they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were walking forward, together. The past remained behind them, not forgotten, not forgiven, but no longer holding the reins. And somewhere between the silence and the dust, something new began to breathe, something that for the first time felt like peace.
When the smoke clears and the bodies fall, only silence remains. If this story touched you, subscribe, because in the West, nothing stays buried for long.